Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are diving into an incredibly exciting explainer. We're going to be walking through an absolute masterclass in strategic sourcing. And I'm so pumped to share this with you because we aren't just talking about abstract theory today. We are looking at a real-world, highly intense procurement transformation case study that took place at the Malualkon base in South Sudan back in March of 2016. Basically, what we're going to unpack is a true McKinsey-style management consulting narrative, but actually executed from the inside by a senior procurement leader. We're going to see exactly how you take a messy, high-risk operational nightmare and completely transform it into a structured, analytics-driven success story. Honestly, it practically writes the blueprint for stepping right into a director-level supply chain role.
Okay, let's dive straight into this. We have a highly structured agenda today, following a classic situation, complication, question, and answer framework. So first, we'll establish the high-risk sourcing context. Second, we'll look at the strategic sourcing dilemma. Third, we'll get into the consulting magic, the BoQ-Driven analytical framework. Fourth, we'll cover commercial strategy and leadership. Fifth, we'll hit the quantified business impact. And then finally, we'll wrap it all up with a strategic executive insight.
All right, Section 1, high-risk sourcing context, operating in a fragile market. Now, before we get into all the polished analytics and slick strategic frameworks, we really have to ground ourselves in the actual operating environment. This was absolutely not your standard, comfortable corporate office procurement exercise. Take a look at the sheer physical intensity of this environment. We are talking about critical humanitarian infrastructure, specifically building a flush toilet block, an ordinary latrine block, and septic systems out in a deeply arid, challenging landscape. The physical execution here is incredibly rugged. And the stakes? Well, they're deeply human. Mission-critical sanitation facilities are literally on the line. Because at the end of the day, no matter how brilliant your spreadsheet or your scoring model is, if it doesn't translate to reliable physical execution in a fragile market, it fails.
So let's look at the exact constraints the procurement leadership faced here. The total project value is just over $25,000. Now you might be thinking, well, in the grand scheme of corporate spend, 25 grand is tiny. But actually, the risk exposure was massive. It required absolute director-level oversight. The team was dealing with three distinct heavy dimensions of risk. First up, execution risk. Contractor capacity in this specific region was incredibly limited. Second, supplier reliability in such a constrained local market was completely unpredictable. And third, they were staring down strict financial and audit compliance exposure governed by rigid institutional rules. It was basically a pressure cooker of multi-component civil works with exceptionally tight delivery timelines.
Moving right along to Section 2, the strategic sourcing dilemma, balancing tensions.
You know, every great case study centers on a core complication, right? Here, the end-to-end sourcing owner found themselves facing a really classic yet incredibly intense set of conflicting priorities. This was the central strategic question that the leadership mandate absolutely had to solve. How do we select a supplier that actually delivers technically sound infrastructure at an optimized cost while simultaneously mitigating those massive execution and compliance risks we just talked about? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it captures the daily tightrope walk of a senior supply chain leader. On one hand, you have cost versus technical integrity. Going with the absolute lowest price could very easily mask an incomplete technical scope, a supplier just trying to win the bid without truly understanding the work involved. On the other hand, you've got speed versus governance. There was this urgent, mission-critical need to get these sanitation facilities built, but that urgency was constantly grinding against mandatory procurement compliance and audit rules. You couldn't just casually pick a local supplier, you had to definitively prove they had technical credibility.
Which brings us to Section 3, BoQ-Driven analytical framework, the consulting magic.
So, how did the procurement leader actually break through this dilemma? Well, this is the action phase, where a really messy, unpredictable bidding process gets transformed into a rigorous, data-driven model. Because the process required a negotiated procedure with a minimum of 3 competitive bids, the leader designed a bottom-up Bill of Quantities, or BoQ, analysis. They didn't just casually glance at the final price tag on the bids. No, they broke the entire project down into 8 standardized, mutually exclusive components. Things like preliminaries, substructure, superstructure, roofing, fittings and plumbing, finishes, septic tank, and pit latrine works. By forcing the supplier bids into this decomposed structure, they finally created a true apples-to-apples comparison across all the potential vendors.
And by normalizing that cost structure, breaking it down into materials, labor at roughly 25 to 30%, and transport at 10 to 15%, the leader established vital baseline benchmarks. For example, the data revealed that $14,056 was the reliable benchmark for the flush toilet block alone. and it was $5,659 for the pit latrine. This wasn't just guesswork. This was analytical excellence, empowering real negotiation.
And this right here, this brilliantly illustrates the dramatic peak of the entire analysis. Just look at it. On the surface, the total costs were all hovering right around $25,000 to $26,000. If you were an amateur buyer just looking at the headline price, you'd probably think, they're all virtually identical. But that bottom-up BoQ model exposed a massive hidden risk. Notice that top row. The supplier building view submitted a bid of roughly $25,600, but the item-level deep dive revealed that they completely omitted the cost of cement in their pit latrine construction. Galitonic Trading, right below them, came in a bit lower at $25,186, but with a completely balanced, fully compliant BoQ.
Now, you might be wondering, why is catching some missing cement such a huge deal? Well, in a fixed-price contract out in a fragile region, if a contractor realizes halfway through a build that they totally forgot to budget for cement, what happens? I'll tell you what happens. They just stop working. They demand more money. Suddenly, you are facing severe cost escalation, a massive risk of nasty scope disputes, and a total collapse of cost credibility. This analytical framework literally saved the project from a disastrous execution failure right out there in the field.
All right, Section 4, Commercial Strategy and Leadership. Driving consensus.
Identifying the risk is really only half the battle for a procurement director, right? You then have to structure the commercial strategy to lock in the wins from that analytical phase. Here, the sourcing owner took decisive leadership. They mandated a fixed-price construction agreement strictly tied to that validated BoQ. They implemented a payment structure that relied entirely on scheduled bank transfers, completely eliminating the extreme risks of handling cash. They forced mandatory supplier documentation. We're talking licenses, registrations, tax IDs, ensuring absolute audit readiness. And they required a multi-level approval process where BoQ completeness validation had to be formally signed off prior to the award. This is exactly how you proactively engineer risk mitigation directly into your commercial terms.
But as anyone in management knows, cross-functional alignment, that's tough. The leader had to coordinate between technical engineering experts, field logistics folks, and finance budget controllers. So when tensions flared up over speed versus compliance, the leader used a brilliant three-step process. Step 1, anchor all decisions purely in the BoQ-Driven analytics. Step 2, use that structured evaluation matrix to completely depersonalize the decisions. It wasn't about opinions or gut feelings anymore. It was just about the math. And Step 3, build final consensus through logical, fact-based trade-offs.
Section 5, Quantified Business Impact, Measurable Results.
So let's see how all of this builds into the results phase of our story. What was the actual quantified business impact of this rigorous approach? Here, we can see the specific executive choices that were made and their direct outcomes. By choosing to reject a bid that might have appeared competitive on the surface but lacked completeness, they directly avoided severe execution risk. By selecting Galitonic Trading, a highly experienced supplier, they prioritized reliability and ensured delivery certainty. And by strictly enforcing that BoQ validation, they traded just a tiny bit of upfront speed for absolute ironclad governance.
And the definitive victories are super clear here. The leader achieved roughly a 4% cost avoidance compared to the highest bid, optimizing the budget without sacrificing an ounce of quality. They achieved 100% adherence to procurement governance, meaning a minimum of 3 bids, a rigorous matrix, all required signatures acquired. They completely eliminated their exposure to the supplier with the incomplete scope. But most importantly, they enabled the timely, successful construction of mission-critical sanitation facilities on the base. They proved, without a doubt, that it is entirely possible to balance speed, cost, and strict compliance all at the same time.
Finally, Section 6, Strategic Executive Insight, the so what.
You know, in the consulting world, we always ask the so what question. What does this case study actually prove about the person who led it? Well, it proves their absolute readiness for a senior-level category manager or procurement director role in competitive global markets, like North America and specifically Canada. This engagement was really about shifting an entire organizational mindset. It perfectly defines the value-based procurement model, moving a team away from a dangerous, purely price-focused selection mentality and insisting instead on total cost transparency, flawless technical completion, and guaranteed execution reliability. It shows a leader who doesn't just process transactions, but actually designs robust methodologies.
I really want to leave you with this exact quote from the source material, because it just so perfectly sums up the mandate of modern supply chain leadership. Translate procurement from an operational function into a strategic lever, delivering measurable cost efficiency while safeguarding quality, continuity, and long-term value. This whole case study from South Sudan is an incredible testament to how analytical excellence and commercial leadership can overcome even the absolute most fragile operating environments. So here's my final provocative question for you to ponder today. Are you currently just sourcing for a price? Or are you utilizing your data to strategically engineer certainty into your supply chain? Think about that as you look at your next big project. Until next time, keep learning and keep explaining.